So, this negotiation is described by its advocates as an agreement for the 21st century that will take rules of international agreements where they have never gone before. And in particular, they want to take them beyond what the existing agreements have tended to do. That is, deal with the kind of barriers to exports and goods, or even to deal with some of the barriers to money flitting around the world, or to foreign investors being able to go and do what they like, where they like. The agenda here, as we're finding out more and more, is to alter the way that decisions are made within our countries, and to put constraints and criteria around what are going to be the priorities for decisions, to give commercial interests a guaranteed seat at the table, and to, as we heard oh so vividly before, remove the red tape and the obstacles that participatory processes and balanced criteria might pose to regulatory regimes that work in the interests of the 1%. And that is what they mean by an agreement for the 21st century. And part of what I'm writing at the moment, we've had a couple of quite useful leaks of documents around this area. And I'm trying to put together an explanation. I'm doing a seminar at Treasury on Wednesday. And I'm going to try to explain to them how a particularly pernicious proposal of Rodney Hyde's called the Regulatory Responsibility Bill, which would have tied the hands of policymakers in New Zealand to go for the most light-handed regulation that has the least intrusive government and participatory processes, where the economic interests could challenge any failure to comply with those regulatory responsibility principles, challenge those in the courts. And the Treasury didn't think that was a good idea. And I'm going to say to them, well, that actually is exactly what the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will do. But it's not local companies who are the ones who are going to be challenging it in our domestic courts. It's going to be foreign companies who are going to be challenging our exercise of our sovereign decision-making power to have balanced decisions that reflect the range of social, cultural, economic, treaty development objectives in this country. And they will challenge those not within our domestic domain, our select committees and other parts of our national process, but in a range of offshore mechanisms that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will set up. So this is a quantitative leap beyond the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement and any of those other kinds of agreements. This is actually about putting a straitjacket on our ability to make decisions for our future and to give major corporate interests the right to challenge any deviations from that. Now, Treasury didn't like that version from Rodney Hyde in its benign form. And so I think we need to make sure that some of those who are the power brokers in Wellington actually understand what it is that they're sending their people along to negotiate as well. So when we've been trying to work out what is happening with these negotiations, we have been looking at many of the micro levels, and some of you will have seen the discussions that there have been about what are the impacts for farming. What happens when the big pharmaceutical companies not only get rules that allow them to have more powers over patents, so generic medicines aren't easily accessible, that pushes the price down of meds and so on. They're actually less interested than that, than having, under what goes chapter called transparency, the right of the pharmaceutical companies to have a seat at the pharmac table. Right? To demand to know what are the formula that pharmac is using to assess the prices that it will pay, to be able to challenge the decision making and the criteria pharmac uses, and to be able behind the scenes to put pressures on the processes. So when Tim Grosser says the fundamentals of pharmac won't change, they won't, except that the big pharmaceutical companies will now have their feet under the table. And that's a part of the new agenda. Another part you may have heard with the Kim.com saga, and when John Key went to Hollywood. And he was being feted there, not actually around Kim.com, but around the desire of Hollywood to get new rules under the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that will give them a lot more guaranteed rights to control what we can do here in the use of the internet, the ability to parallel import DVDs and so on, which is actually what the Warehouse and others constantly do, but also which will make it much more difficult for the local IT communities like Weta Workshop, and all of those who are in the cutting edge of the new threatening digital domain that Hollywood and the music industry and so on are losing power to. They want new rules that are going to cut them off at the knees. And they want to be able to have a dialogue with our government about whatever rules we are or aren't introducing, and ultimately to have the ability to challenge them if they think that they are breaching minimum standards of guarantees to Hollywood or the music industry in these offshore tribunals. And they're not actually that interested in the case itself. They're interested in what we call the chilling effect of getting the government to back off so it doesn't have these long, expensive, embarrassing court cases, just like the tobacco companies are doing. So all of those television adverts, yeah, British American Tobacco with their, we know we kill people, but it's freedom of choice. And it's the thin end of the wedge, because we might have labels on wine bottles, or we might have the other kinds of rights of individuals being infringed. Well, sorry, tobacco companies. You know, just like Hollywood and the music industry, that you're a declining twilight business. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership for them is a desperate way to cling back onto positions of power in deciding how we deal with the tobacco epidemic. And so the chapter I'm writing on at the moment, which is a lovely little benign chapter, well, two actually. One's called Transparency, which is not about transparency for us, but transparency for the corporations. And the second is Regulatory Coherence, which is all about setting in place a series of requirements of how we have to go about decisions about new policies and laws the cost-benefit analysis we have to do, which weighs up what the costs for the commercial sector will be, but the unquantifiable costs, the costs for heritage, the cumulative costs, the costs of the long-term impacts on our communities, the implications for tangata whenua and mana motuhake, all of those don't come into the cost-benefit equation. And so they want to lay down a requirement that in our decision-making we have to follow these criteria and these processes. We have to put all the information out there. We have to look at all the submissions that are made by the industries, the commercial interests. We have to explain why we're not pursuing the proposals that they've put forward. We need to show the evidence that justifies our approach as being the least intrusive on the commercial interests that are at stake of the whole range of options that might be available. All of which provides ammunition for the corporations, if we don't go down the pathway that they want, to then threaten to sue us. And so this is a really pernicious agreement. And there are many, many other elements of it. So when we're looking at that, you have to ask, why is there so little discussion about it? And one of the reasons is that it's branded as a trade agreement. And who's interested in a trade agreement? And trade's the best thing since sliced bread. And so there is a perception problem. But there's also a problem about drawing the connections. Because as you've had here, everyone's got fires they're fighting. I was down in Christchurch last week talking at the WEA's 50th annual lecture. And they've got all of this reorganisation of their schools. And they know that they're an experiment ground. And they know that the crisis is being used as a justification for removing schools from the public system to put them into the private domain that communities will have no control over. And for them, this is a local fight. It's a local fight with the insurance companies, who were happy in the good times and who don't want to pay up in the bad. It's a battle over the public-private partnership hospitals that are being set up because the government doesn't want to have to invest all the money in the rebuild. And so they've got local crises there, all of which are linked into this agenda in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But it's really hard to see the big picture when you're trying to focus on daily survival. It's similar for the people who have been fighting the finance company collapses. And we're seeing time after time after time those who are the victims of the light-handed regulation of the finance sector. What re-regulation's there been? Who's been held accountable? What's going to stop it happening again? Who's going to squeal, ring the fire alarms, if the government says we need to re-regulate? Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is designed to ensure that governments don't re-regulate. Certainly don't re-regulate in ways that the banks don't approve of. Leaky buildings. Light-handed regulation. Who's been held accountable? Who's left holding the baby? What's happened to the reconstruction of the construction sector? Very little. Indeed, if we look at the reviews of the RMA, all of your notified consents are going to intensify because there's too much red tape binding these people who have no accountability. And if it all goes pear-shaped again and we actually do want to re-regulate, who's going to ring the fire alarms? Who's going to say to government, we'll sue you if you do? Pike River, the mining industry, the health and safety laws. We know on Monday that they're going to come out with a review that says there was a huge systemic failure, light-handed regulation of exactly what's being promoted in the regulatory coherence chapter, which the mining companies, once they've got their feet under the table, not only onshore but all the offshore ones, who are out there now getting the exploration licenses when the government admits there is no regulatory regime in place. We want to re-regulate? Well, sorry, you need to show us that this is the most light-handed, least burdensome approach for the industry sector that's not going to have a substantial negative impact on the value of their investments and of their profit. Otherwise, we'll sue you. Tharina. We want to have bonds for those who are going to be playing Russian roulette in our shipping routes. We actually want to make you stick to the shipping routes. We actually want to have liability where you clean up the mess. Sorry, that's going to make us unprofitable. So these are all the kinds of lock-ins that communities all around the country are now already dealing with, that they are going to try to make sure that we can't address. There is some good news. This agreement, which was 9, the US plus 8, and if you think of a map, it's now going to be 11. There's 2 new countries that are coming to join in December. So we now start with Canada. We go Canada, the US, Mexico, Peru, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam. And so we have this rim. And the idea is that we don't just have this 21st century model across those 11 countries. We set it as a model for what America quaintly calls the Pacific, which is Asia. And so they want, if you ask what the agenda is, they want on the one hand for their corporate and economic interests, and by they I mean predominantly the US, to have a harmonised system of rules that allows a seamless operation by transnational corporations across not only those 11 countries, but the whole 23 countries of the entity known as APEC. And so that would tie up in that light-handed model effectively the futures of 1 billion and a bit people, because you've got China in that picture as well. But there's a second agenda, and this is the one that is really quite scary but potentially implosive. It's become much more explicit that the US objective is not just commercial for its corporations. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and more recently both Barack Obama and his Republican contender, have said that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement is the bulwark for the US against China. So it is a geopolitical game. And Hillary Clinton said in November last year at the APEC meeting in Honolulu, there are two limbs to what she refers to as America's Pacific century. Now, Pacific, as I said, in the US means Asia. The first limb is military. So the realignment of military forces from Iraq and Afghanistan across to the Asia Pacific, right from Australia, Singapore, Guam, Philippines, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, is all about repositioning the military presence in relation to China. And of course they offered us as well. The other limb is the economic limb, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that would tie up the model of the region and the allegiances of the countries in the region to the US and to the power of the US corporations. That is their explicit objective. It has a bit of a problem that China is actually more powerful in the ascendancy than the US. And many of the countries that they are aspiring to bring into this web are already deeply linked to China. And that is going to raise really interesting issues. Is that my phone? I hope not. Oh, no, it's not. It's good. My students always loved it if I got caught out. China and ASEAN, which is a very big bloc, have been brokering their own mega deal. And in December, negotiations will begin for what they are describing as the biggest economic integration agreement ever in the world, which will be the ASEAN countries plus 6 other countries: Japan, China, Korea, India, Australia and New Zealand. And so we will be trying to play off both of these mega players and pretend that we can have it both ways, which is not actually how either China or the US works. But it's also positioning us right in the middle of a potentially implosive geopolitical contest between a declining superpower and an aspiring superpower, neither of which is benign. And so there is a much bigger picture at play here. It's not only taking our power away in the domestic domain to make our own decisions, but it is repositioning us in another of those global superpower battles. Now, I did say that there's some optimistic news. Well, I think that's sort of optimistic because I think it's going to, they're going to have some problems. But it's also becoming very difficult for them to close out the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. The US has to get this deal through its Congress. Now that means it has a veto power over whatever's in the agreement. But it also means that it has to try to satisfy all of the constituencies in the US Congress, who range across the dairy constituency to the tobacco industry to the Labour Democrats to a whole range of different players who are all putting unbelievably aggressive demands on the table. So aggressive that people are saying no. Now, if they were actually being a bit more reasonable, it would be much more likely they would have got the deal done. But they are being so aggressive with their demands that they are undeliverable for many countries. They would cripple, literally, some countries. and they are hitting holy grails in others. And so the really good news is that the negotiations are quite bogged down. Areas like pharmaceuticals, the IT sector, the right of the investors to sue, attacks on state enterprises, a whole range of those areas. And the technicians have got to the stage, the legal technicians in these 29 working parties have been stripping away the bits of disagreements to get to the core of where the fault line is. And the good thing is that the fault line is really bad in some places. The bad news is that if you get politicians and political leaders in a room doing deals, the fact that some of them will be really bad won't necessarily stop them doing the deals. So our strategy is obviously to try to throw as many spanners in the works as we can to make those fault lines as difficult as possible in a technical sense, but at the same time to make the trade-offs as politically unsaleable in our domestic worlds as we can. And different countries have different red lines. So we have to work out in this country which are the biggest risks that people are likely to go to fight for. There are a number, right? And different sectors will fight for different ones. There's people who fight the mining issues. There are people who fight the pharmaceutical issues. People who fight the tobacco issues, or who fight some of the labour law issues or the foreign investment issues, or there's a very big IT group called fairdeal.net.nz. So we've got all of those, but we all have to make it a gut fight about our future. And so we've actually rebranded TPP Watch to itsourfuture.org.nz to try to get a sense that if we lose this, then all of the micro battles that we're fighting are going to be unwinnable because the doors are going to have been closed, or they're going to be bloody hard. And so in December, when this round of negotiations is at Sky City Casino, well, Sky City Convention Centre, but we know how closely linked the slot machines are to the convention centre, from the 3rd to the 10th, we are going to be trying to put the spotlight in as many parts of the country as possible on the issues that affect those local communities. And so there will be activities in Auckland that we will be organising, but we're hoping in particular on the National Day of Action, which is Saturday the 8th of December, that there will be relevant focused activities in different communities all around the motu. And that we can have good information and publicity and links across those who are taking that action. And I know that you guys are incredibly creative, and we would love to hear what ideas you have. There will also, as I said, be a range of other activities, but there are things that we've got going now. For example, we've got a national cartoon competition with 3 $500 prizes. $500 prize for the best one selected by Philly McDonald, $500 prize that's going to be a viewer's voting prize, and a $500 prize for the best student cartoon. And so if you go on to the itsourfuture.org.nz website, you'll see a range of activities that we've got going there. And we would love to have as much of Waihiki's creative energies and political energies as possible being brought to bear. And if people feel like writing poems, or songs, or anything else that can add to the Creative Commons, it would be wonderful. Because December is our ability to put the spotlight on this thing. We're not likely to have it back here again before we kill it. But it does give us that real chance to get people's minds focused and build up the political momentum and the momentum within communities. That means if it does come to a deal, negotiated in secret that we don't see till it's done, we can make that deal unsaleable. So that's the message. Yep.
Kia ora, Jane. Jane,